What's up guys, mtg back with another video, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different than usual. No gameplay in this video. Instead, I want to give you my top 10 picks for new control tools that March of the Machine offers to us control players. So I like playing control the most, so whenever a new expansion drops, I'm most interested in checking out what new tools we control players get. And I thought this might be interesting for you other control guys out there too. So let's get into it. The way I'm gonna do this, I just put the cards up on the screen I talk about. I have some notes here, so from time to time I will look down. And that's how it's gonna go. So let's get started. First up, before we go into the actual top 10, I want to talk about some honorable mentions. And I tried to keep this short and crisp and clean. But there's just some cards that didn't go into my top 10, but which I think are really interesting to look at as control players. And we start off things here with Invasion of Arcavios, which is a blue battle for 5 mana. It's got 7 defense counters, which is, I think, one of the highest defense counters from all the battles, or I think it is the highest together with the Alara battle. And it says when it enters the battlefield, you search your library, graveyard, and or outside the game for an instant or sorcery card you own, put it into your hand, and if you search your library, display shuffle. And then on the backside, if you manage to transform this, you got Invocation of the Founders, which is an enchantment that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand, you may copy that spell, and you may choose new targets for a copy. Why I mention this card is because right now in Standard, this is the only wish effect we have. A wish effect being a card that lets you get a card from your sideboard while you're in the game. So that's why Invasion of Arcavios is very unique. And as a control player, it's, you know, you're just getting one card for 5 mana, which is terrible. But you could put like one of these into your control deck, especially in best of 1, this is really nice. And then you have like a sideboard full of tools, tool-like instant or sorceries that can be a win condition, like White Sun's Twilight, for example, or just anything that can help you in your current game situation. So that's why Invasion of Arcavios, I think, is worth mentioning. And then also, if you happen to flip it somewhere, right, in a control deck, you can have Wandering Emperor that chips away at this. The Invocation of the Founders is just super powerful, copying every instant or sorcery spells you have. So Invasion of Arcavios, definitely worth mentioning here in the honorable mentions. Next honorable mention is Invasion of Regatha, which is this 3 mana battle with 5 defense counters, and it says when it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to another target battle or opponent and 1 damage to up to 1 target creature. And then on the backside you got the Disciples of the Inferno that have prowess and, you know, that increase the damage from your non-creature sources. The backside isn't that important. What's important is the front side, because this deals 4 damage to a battle. And the thing is that as control players, you're less likely to have a board presence, so you really need to search for those cards in the new meta that let you damage battles directly if you want to play them in your control deck. And Invasion of Regatha deals 4 damage to a battle for 3 mana, and there are a bunch of battles that have exactly 4 defense counters, and the invasion can enable you to basically flip those battles without the need of running creatures in your deck. And that's why I think Invasion of Regatha is well worth mentioning. In certain situations, it might even be able to finish off your opponent with 4 damage to the face, or even pick off a small creature with that 1 damage. So that's really nice. Next up, we got one of my personal favorite cards from the expansion, Oracle of Tragedy, which is a 2 mana 1/3 human wizard. And when it enters the battlefield or dies, you get to choose one. You either draw a card or discard a card. Or, and that's the important part, you shuffle up to 4 target cards with mana value 3 or greater from your graveyard into your library. I absolutely love this card. This is made for me because I love decks that can go infinite. And this little creature, in the early game, it can just, you know, filter your hand, makes you draw a card, discard a card when it enters, and then also when it dies if you block against aggressive decks. So really smooths out your first hands. And then later in the game, this allows you to, well, shuffle all your stuff back into the library, right? Like all your counter spells, card draw spells, board wipes, whatever. And if you want to go infinite, you just need one way to shuffle oracles back into the deck. And because of that, I think this card is super interesting and definitely deserves a mentioning. Next up, we got another personal favorite of mine, which is Phyrexian Censor, 3 mana 3/3 in white, which says each player can cast more than one non-Phyrexian spell each turn and non-Phyrexian creatures enter the battlefield tab. I really love decks that can lock out your opponent, and Phyrexian Censor is a rule of law type of effect, where most of the time you will restrict your opponent to just one spell per turn and yourself. But if you build your deck around it and have a way to repeatedly have counter spells up, you can basically lock your opponent out of the game, because when Censor is on the board and your opponent casts their one spell each turn and you counter that spell each turn, they basically can't get back into the game. That's why Phyrexian Censor is really something to keep in mind if you want to build a prison type control deck. Next up for the honorable mentions, we got Overgrown Pest, which is a 3 mana 2/2. And when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library and you get a land card or a double-faced card from them and put it into your hand. I mention this because Contagious Vortex sees a lot of play in the current meta, which is a 3/3 that gives you a land. So Overgrown Pest obviously got worse stats, but it lets you look at one more card compared to Contagious Vortex, and also lets you get a double-faced card. So while I do think in the end the low stats will keep it from it being played, because the 3/3 stat line in Vorek is really nice for blocking, whereas the 2/2 stat line is really fragile. I do think this is worth a try. If you're in a deck that runs a lot of battles, for example, Overgrown Pest can really help you in the early game to get your land drops, or just later in the game find the battles that you want to play. Next up, we get on another personal favorite of mine, which is Herbology Instructor, 2 mana 1/3. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. Very simple, very straightforward. Really nice in a control-y type of deck where you run green and want to have some stabilizer in the early game. But that alone would not be reason enough to run this card. Where this card gets playable, I think, is that it has this transform ability. For a 6 and a Phyrexian black, you transform it, and it turns into Melody Invoker, which says when this creature transforms, target creature an opponent controls gets -0/-X until end of turn, where X is Melody Invoker's power. So the beauty of this card is that in the early game, it's a 2 mana 1/3 blocker that gains you 3 life. Really nice against aggressive decks, but then also has a use in the late game, where in the late game you can play it, transform it, and kill any creature that has toughness 3 or less. So that's why I think Herbology Instructor is definitely worth mentioning. Alright, we're almost done with the honorable mentions, just 3 more cards, starting off with Sunder the Gateway, which is a 2 mana sorcery in white that says choose one, destroy target non-token artifact or enchantment and opponent controls incubate 2, or incubate 2, then transform incubator token you control. So the reason I mention this card is that in a control deck, this is super flexible artifact and enchantment removal, because either you use it to destroy an artifact or enchantment, which there are plenty of in standard, and I think there might be even more in the coming standard. And then you even get an incubate token that you can turn into a 2/2 later, or in the worst case scenario, if you're up against a very aggressive deck, you just play this as a 2 mana 2/2, which isn't great at all. But in best of 1, having this flexibility, I think this card is worth taking a look at, just because of that flexibility. Next up, we got a similar card that got its strength from its flexibility, which is Atraxa's Fall. 2 mana sorcery in green, destroy target artifact, battle, enchantment, or creature with flying. So I know this is sorcery speed, but it's just 2 mana for a lot of versatility. First of all, you get to destroy a creature with flying. That can be relevant. We'll have to see though, but, like the obvious target would be something like Atraxa, right? And then you got just straight up artifact enchantment removal, very flexible. And in the upcoming meta, this even destroys battles, which can be, especially for control decks, can be really relevant, because if you don't have a board presence, it's hard to defend those battles, so Traxxas Fall will be a way to get rid of those battles very flexibly. And the final honorable mention here I want to talk about is Render Inert, 3-mana sorcery in black. Remove up to 5 counters from target permanent, draw a card. So this card is in here for the same reason that we had Invasion of Regatha in here, which is that in a control deck where you don't have a board presence, this is a way to play battles against your opponent and finish them without the need to, attack them with creatures, right? Render Inert can just remove those counters from the battles. It replaces itself because it draws a card, and then you can flip those battles. And another nice mode is this can also just kill planeswalkers, right? If they got 5 or less loyalty. So Render Inert, because of that, is worth taking a look at. And then finally, for the honorable mentions, I just want to mention 4 cards at once, which is there is a cycle of monocolored cards that are good specifically against color combinations, and that is Lithomantic Barrage, Change the Equation, Glistening Deluge, and Surge of Salvation. I'm mentioning these cards because I think they're purely for a sideboarding, but for that they're fantastic against those color combinations, so keep those in mind if you are a best of 3 player. Alright, now with those honorable mentions out of the way, we can finally get to the top 10. A small note here, these are in no particular order, so I don't have a ranking from 10 to 1. It's just my top 10 tools for control players for Martial Machines. And we're starting off with Elspeth's Smite. So Elspeth's Smite is a 1-mana instant in white that says it is 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. This is absolutely fantastic cheap removal for control decks. Dealing 3 damage at instant speed for just 1 mana is an insanely good rate. And on top of that, this even exiles, which is very relevant against stuff like Tenacious Underdog. This really kills most creatures up until mana value 3. There are outliers like Adeline that have 4 toughness, but for the most part, you can kill everything up until mana value 3 from opponent, and Elspeth's Smite is gonna be excellent for control decks to just have cheap removal against attacking creatures, against aggressive decks, and it's just an absolutely fantastic card. I can't wait to put this into my control decks. Number 2 on my top 10 list for control tools is Volcanic Spite. This is a 2-mana instant in red that says it deals 3 damage to target creature, planeswalker, or battle, and you may put a card from your hand on the bottom of a library if you do draw a card. So this card is amazing for several reasons. First of all, it hits creatures, planeswalkers, and battles. So this is very versatile removal at instant speed. And on top of that, it's got this mode where you can basically cycle a card from your hand, which is especially great in the early game if you're looking for that land drop, if you're looking for that board wipe to stabilize. But then also why this card is so important for the upcoming meta for control decks is because if you want to play battles as a control deck, you're gonna want to look for ways to damage those battles without the need of having creatures on the board. And Volcanic Spite can deal 3 damage to battles and enables you to flip a battle as a control deck rather easily. So because of that, because of the versatility, because of the card filtering aspect, I think this is just another fantastic addition to removal spells for control decks. Next up, we got a personal favorite of mine, which is Sea Double. So Sea Double is a 4-mana instant in blue that says this spell can't be copied. And then you choose one. If an opponent has 8 or more cards in the graveyard, you may choose both. You either copy target spell, you may choose a new target for a copy, or you create a token that's a copy of target creature. Now, first of all, I want to talk about the condition. You can choose both if an opponent has 8 or more cards in the graveyard. This is in blue, so you can really just run this with Jace, right? Even a 3-mana Jace mills your opponent for 9, and right there you've met the condition to just choose both modes on the spell. But even if you just have one mode, I think this card is absolutely incredible. Um, there are so many play patterns with this. First of all, very simple, your opponent casts an Invoke Despair. You just copy their Invoke Despair, right? You give it back to them, and you keep up the tempo this way, right? You don't lose tempo as your opponent casts an Invoke Despair. Maybe you have an empty board, but you give it back to them, you remove their Shieldred and the Liliana, something like that. You can also obviously copy your own spells, but this is probably gonna come up fewer times, right? Because casting a spell and then paying 4 mana on top of it is rather unlikely. I think most likely it is that your opponent will cast a spell and then you copy their spell for 4 mana. And you can copy permanent spells. If your opponent casts a Shieldred, you just copy their Shieldred, and now you get a Shieldred of your own. And this mitigates the damage you take from drawing cards. But then, speaking of Shieldred, you can create a token that's a copy of target creatures. So imagine just the scenario: you have an empty board, your opponent attacks with a Shieldred, you copy their Shieldred, you block with your Shieldred, it has Death Touch, both Shieldreds die, right? So C-Double, I think, is an amazingly versatile spell. If you're playing a control deck and you're removing stuff left and right, it's not unreasonable to assume that your opponent gets 8 cards into a graveyard naturally, as long as the game goes on for long enough. So I can't wait to play with this card, try it out, and just see how it feels. And I think it's just a fantastic tool for control players. Next up, we got another removal spell that's very versatile, which is Nahiri's Warcrafting, 3 mana sorcery in red. It deals 5 damage to a creature, planeswalker, or battle. And then you look at the top X cards of your library where X is the excess damage you dealt, and you may exile one of those cards and play that card this turn. Now, first of all, what I want to say about this card, there are just some basic things about this card that make it seem very playable in the current meta, which is it deals 5 damage, and 5 damage is important because this means this can kill a Shieldred, which is super important for control decks. That's 5 damage is an important benchmark for that. Then, for the same reason I mentioned other cards in this list, is that this can hit battles and deals 5 damage. And from the battles that I think are interesting for control players, none of them have more than 5 defense counters. So Nahiri's Warcrafting is yet another way to flip battles you play as a control player without the need for a board presence. So I think because of that, this is fantastic. This obviously also is Planeswalkers, so it's very versatile. And then about this card draw aspect, where you deal excess damage. This for me, this is more or less just a cherry on top. But I think what's really cool about this is that you may exile a card, you're not forced to, which means that, let's say you remove a 3 toughness creature, you get to take a look at the top 2 cards of your library. There isn't a land there that you can just play, there are only expensive spells. You just don't exile a spell, right? You just say, I'm good. And you still looked at those cards, you can shuffle them back. So I think Nahiri's Warcrafting, mostly fantastic because it can kill battles as a control player. It kills Shieldred, and it has this mode where it can replace itself. So I think Nahiri's Warcrafting is definitely a great card for control players. Next up, we got another fantastic option for low mana removal for control decks, and that is Ithara's Dispersal. 3 mana instant in blue, which says this spell costs 2 less to cast if it targets an attacking creature. So in that case, this just costs 1 blue mana, and return target creature to its owner's hand, Surveil 2. Now, Fading Hope does see play from time to time standard, less than it used to be, but it still sees some play. And I think Ithara's Dispersal, all things considered, is just way better, because what you really want from Fading Hope is that Scry 1 when you return a creature with mana value 3 or less. Ithara's Dispersal doesn't ask you for the creature to be mana value 3 or less, it just asks you for the creature to be attacking, so that this costs 1 mana. And if you're against an aggressive deck where this card is going to be the best, right? Your opponent's creatures are going to be attacking, so you will most of the time just cast this for a single blue mana. And then you return the creature and you get to surveil 2. And surveilling 2 is so much better than scrying 1. Maybe you have graveyard synergies, you get to look at more cards, and this can just really slow down your opponent in the early game. You get to, you know, make your draws a lot better with this surveil 2. And Ephira's Dispersal combined with Elspeth's Smite, I think is Azorius Control. So many good low mana removal spells that this is just fantastic, and I can't wait to try this out in Azorius Control deck. Next up, we got a card that I think flies under a lot of people's radar for control players, mostly maybe because of the color combination, but I don't shy away from stuff like Rule Control, Naya Control. I think those are really cool concepts. And for those decks, Kogla in Nidaro is one of my top picks. So it's a 6 mana creature, right? You pay 2 generic, 2 red, 2 green for a 7/7 legendary creature. And when it enters the battlefield, we choose one. Kogla and Nidaro gain trample and haste on the end of turn, or they fight target creature you don't control. Now, let's just think about these modes before we read the rest of the card. What this means is that at 6 mana, in a control deck, you can either have a finisher, right? This comes down, 7/7 trample haste, can really pressure your opponent. It's also with the trample great at removing opposing planeswalkers. Or this is a creature that acts as a removal spell, because with 7 power and 7 toughness, Kogla Nidaro will kill most opposing creatures without dying. Sure, there are exceptions like a shield red that has death touch, this will also kill that. But most of the time, this will come down, fight an opposing creature, stay on the board, so this acted like a removal spell, and you got a 7/7 out of the deal. So because of this versatility, this also already makes it pretty good for control decks, but it doesn't end there. It's got basically like this channel ability where you pay 4 mana and discard it to destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment. You shuffle Kogla and Nidaro back into your library, and then you get to draw a card. And I think if you play, which I want to try out, right? I want to try like a Guru control deck, Naya control deck. If you put like 2 of these in your deck, at 4 mana, you have straight up artifact and enchantment removal at instant speed, uncounterable because it's an activated ability, not a spell, that replaces itself because you draw a card. And then later in the game, this can act as a removal spell for creatures or as a finisher. And I think this whole package makes this card super cool, super interesting for control decks that are in color combinations where you usually don't see control decks. And because of that, I think Kogla Nidaro is actually fantastic for those types of decks, and I'm really excited to try this out. Next up, we got the only Praetor that made it on this list, and I really thought about this, but I do think that Shieldred is the only Praetor that realistically will find its way into control decks. Now hear me out. So Shieldred, 5 mana 4/5 with Menace. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature or planeswalker. And then for 5 mana, you can transform her as long as an opponent has 8 or more cards in the graveyard. So it's the same condition that needs to be met like with C double. And I do think that is a condition that is pretty realistic to achieve. And then when she'll transform, she becomes the saga, the true scriptures on the first chapter. For each opponent, you destroy up to 1 target creature or planeswalker that player controls. So it's straight up removal of a creature or planeswalkers. Chapter 2, each opponent discards 3 cards, then mills 3 cards. And Chapter 3, put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control, exile the true scriptures, then return it to the battlefield. And it comes back as Shieldred again. Now, the reason I think Shieldred is good in a control deck is because it does very simple things that a control deck wants to do. She comes down, she immediately removes something of your opponent, most likely an important creature because it has to be non-token, or she gets rid of a planeswalker, right? So she does something immediately. A 4/5 Menace is a fine attacker also. But then I actually think that the backside, the sagas, can actually serve as a win condition for control decks, whereas I don't see that at least in a control shell, as much for other Praetors. Because again, on chapter 1, she does something very simple, which is destroying a creature or planeswalker. However, if you think about what's good in control decks, what you're really looking for from a new expansion is just tools that either draw you cards, good tools that draw you cards, or that remove stuff efficiently, right? And that give you more than just removing a creature. And Shieldred is just that. She removes a creature or planeswalker when she comes into play, and then when you transform her, she removes another important thing. And then chapter 2 is really brutal. Like, having your opponent discard 3 cards is insane. That's so much value. And then chapter 3 is an actual win condition, right? Chapter 3 gets you a bunch of creatures on the board, and then it flips, and then remember, Shieldred comes back on the front side, so again your opponent has to sacrifice a non-token creature or planeswalker. And if you like, you can activate it immediately again and destroy another thing. So I think this whole package really grinds your opponent out. It gives you a clear win condition as a control deck with that chapter 3, putting all creatures on the board. And it's just very good removal. Now, when I look at the other Praetors, and I think most people will want to look at Jin-Gitaxias, the blue Praetor, that draws you cards and all stuff. I really thought about Jin-Gitaxias, and I'm definitely going to put it in a control deck and try it out. However, I do think Jin-Gitaxias by itself doesn't really represent a win condition in a control deck, because the Saga, the backside, I don't think does much for control decks to win the game. It draws you a whole bunch of cards, it returns creatures back to the board, and then chapter 3 lets you cast spells from your hand for free. But if you think about it, in a control deck where you just want to control the board, remove stuff, most of the time you have like 1 or 2 win conditions in deck, like a Wandering Emperor. And a chapter 3 on Jin-Gitaxias, like, okay, you cast the Wandering Emperor for free. Do you really need that to win the game? I don't think so. So I think because of that, Shieldred is just a better package for a control deck. Can't wait to try her out. I think she's a real cool design. And yeah, that's my 2 cents on Shieldred. Alright, we're nearing the end here slowly, but we still got some bangers, because next up is the only planeswalker on this list, which is Chandra, Hope Speaking. The red planeswalker of the deck, 6 mana, 5 loyalty, has this insane static ability. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. This ability triggers only once each turn. So the static ability alone is fantastic, but let's read the rest of the planeswalker. +2, add 2 mana in any combination of colors. +1, exile top 5 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from among those exiled cards. And then -X, Chandra deals X damage to each of up to 2 targets. Now, I think Chandra is the perfect example of a planeswalker that supports your whole game plan in a control deck, but won't represent a win condition by herself. But she just does so much, right? I think the most common play pattern with Chandra is gonna be you play her for 6 mana, you -4 for a third ability on her, and you kill like 2 creatures or a creature and a planeswalker, right? And she's left with 1 loyalty on her. And then you got a 1 loyalty planeswalker that copies the first instant sorcery spell you cast each turn, which is insane. And from there on, you just get to plus her, right? So +2, add 2 mana in any combination of colors. As a control deck, you can never have enough resources, so that's great. Also, the fact that it's any combination of colors means that there could be decks where you have cards in your deck that, you know, you can transform them for a certain color of mana that you usually don't have. Or let's think about Path of Peril, right? Path of Peril is this black card that for 3 mana destroys all creatures with mana value 2 or less. But then for the cleave cost of 4 black and white, you destroy all creatures instead. Well, if your deck doesn't run white, right, and you got Chandra in the deck, this gives you a way to basically get access to those spells because you get any mana, which I think is noteworthy. Then the +1 draws you a card. Exiling 5 cards the thing is you exile all of them, right? And so a lot of those cards you won't be able to use. However, I think what's nice about the +1 is that you can cast an instant or sorcery until your next turn, which means this works with counter spells, because on your opponent's turn you can still cast a counter spell. And note, at the time you activate this loyalty ability, you don't need to choose the spell you will cast. You can just choose from those at any time until next turn. So depending on what your opponent is doing, this gets very versatile. And yeah, and then the -X, as I said, I think the most common scenario is Chandra will come down and just remove 2 things, and then she stays on the board. So Chandra, I'm definitely going to try out maybe like a Jeskai control shell. Is it control? The copying thing, you know, you don't need to get fancy to get huge value out of this. Just copy your card draw spells. Big Score is really nice with a copy effect, right? Big Score, you get to draw 2 cards and create 2 treasure tokens. That's really cool. And I think in a deck that uses Chandra, you will run Silver Scrutiny over Memory Deluge, because if you copy a Memory Deluge, you don't get to see any cards. And you know, if you just copy a Silver Scrutiny for 5 mana, you get to draw 6 cards for 5 mana because you copied, and it's more than enough value. So I think Chandra is going to be just a fantastic support as Planeswalker in control decks, and yeah, can't wait to try her out. Alright, we're almost through with the list, just the second to last card, which is first battle on this list, and that is Invasion of Innistrad, 4 mana battle in black with 5 defense counters, has flash, very important. When it enters the battlefield, target creature and opponent controls gets -13/-13 until end of turn. So for 4 mana, that's really just destroy target creature, but it gets around indestructible. And then when it flips, you get this enchantment Deluge of Dead, which when enters the battlefield creates 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. And for 3 mana, you get to exile a card from a graveyard, and if it was a creature card, you get another zombie. So I think this card, you put like 2 of these in your control deck. At 4 mana, you just have a destroy target creature effect, which isn't good at all, actually. But you play this for the backside, right? And as I mentioned with Nahiri's Warcrafting deals 5 damage to a target battle. So if you're like maybe in like a Rakdos or Grixis Shell, you can play Invasion of Innistrad as a straight up removal spell and then flip it with Nahiri's Warcrafting, and you immediately get 2 zombies, and it's very nice activated ability that lets you exile cards from graveyard, which is fantastic against the Reanimator strategies that are known in Standard. And also the fact that Deluge of the Dead gives you 2 zombies immediately, gives you a certain board presence, and then as you exile creature cards, this can produce more zombies. I think it's a very straightforward, fantastic tool for control decks, right? Just like 2 of 4 mana, remove target creature, and then basically this builds your board with Deluge of the Dead and exiles cards from graveyard. I think this is really good enough to see play in control decks. And then the final card for my top 10 tools for control decks from March of the Machines is Invasion of Fiora, the second battle on the list, also in black. 6 mana, when it enters the battlefield, choose 1 or both. You destroy all legendary creatures or destroy all non-legendary creatures. So you can just choose both and destroy all creatures on the board. It's a straight up board wipe for that. Or in certain situations, you might have like a single legendary creature on the board, your opponent only has non-legendary creatures. This can be a one-sided board wipe, which is just this like added flexibility, which is really cool. But then on the back side, you got Marchesa Resolute Monarch. And Marchesa is a fantastic value engine. 3/6 with Menace and Death Touch. When she attacks, remove all counters from up to 1 target permanent. So Marchesa by herself can enable all the other battles that you run in your control deck, right? Because she can remove just all counters from those battles and flip them immediately. But this also kills any planeswalker your opponent has by removing all loyalty counters. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if you haven't been dealt combat damage since your last turn, you draw a card and lose 1 life. So this also just draws you card, and I think just as a board wipe, maybe you play like 1, maximum 2 of these in the deck, because 6 mana is an expensive board wipe. but it's like a value board wipe, right? Yeah, it's just a value thing. I think this is also fantastic for control decks. For defense, counter is also the sweet spot that gets it killed by, of course, Nahiri's Warcrafting, but also by the honorable mention that I had, Invasion of Regatha. So it's rather easy to flip compared to other battles. And yeah, that's why I think this is another great tool for control decks. And that's it, guys. That's my top 10 tools for control decks from March of the Machines. Can't wait for this new set. I'm super excited. So let me know in the comments what you think about this list. Did I miss something, or do you disagree? Do you agree? Really looking forward to the comments on this, and I see you guys soon.